In 1849, an entire plantation vanished overnight, fields left burning, masters unburied, and a name carved into a tree, Goliath's daughter. No one ever found her body, but the soil still whispers. The voice of the narrator cuts through static, like an old phonograph resurrected from dust. The story begins in Lowndes County, Alabama, 1849, a land of cotton and secrets where the earth seemed to breathe with resentment. Locals still speak of a woman known only as Elia, born unnaturally tall, broad-shouldered, and silent. They said her mother was struck by lightning the night she gave birth. Others claimed her father was no man at all, but a legend carried from Africa, a warrior of impossible size and sorrow. Elia's presence terrified even those who owned her. She stood taller than any man in the county, 6'8", with hands that looked more like stone than flesh. Yet it wasn't her height that unsettled people. It was her silence. She never spoke, never sang, and when her eyes met yours you felt something vast looking through you. The plantation's preacher called her the Mark of Wrath. The children called her Goliath's daughter, and when the first body appeared in the cane field, skull crushed into the mud, the whispers began. No one would admit it, but every man who died had once laid a hand on her. They buried the first body quietly. No priest, no hymn, just the dull scrape of shovels beneath a moon the color of tarnished brass. The overseer said it was an accident. A mule kicked him, he told the others. But everyone knew that mule hadn't moved all night. The soil in Lowndes County was red, thick, iron-rich like dried blood. They said it could grow anything, but it also had a memory. And after that night, the ground began to reject what was planted. The cotton turned gray, the roots curled upward, and even the crows refused to feed. In the quarters, the other enslaved people whispered of Elia. She had been seen walking at the edge of the swamp before dawn, barefoot, her hands wet with something dark. But when they questioned her, she only stared back. Her silence wasn't fear, it was defiance, as though she was listening to something no one else could hear. The master, Thomas Wren, began to fear her. He ordered the preacher to bless the land. But when the preacher sprinkled holy water, the bottle cracked in his hand. The next morning another man was gone, found near the smokehouse, his head buried in the ashes. Elia was nowhere to be found. That evening, the preacher's wife said she saw her by the river, kneeling in the water, whispering in a language older than the Bible. She said the water rose to meet her hands, then went still. And from that night on, the river stopped flowing. By 1850, Reverend Samuel Fitch had grown old under the shadow of that plantation's curse. His sermons grew darker, stripped of hope. He told the townsfolk that the devil had taken form in the shape of a woman. But those who had known the Reverend before whispered another story. That long ago, before his collar and cross, Samuel Fitch had been a man of science. Hidden behind the church, there was a cellar no one entered. The boards were sealed with tar, the hinges rusted black. Some said the Reverend kept his records there. Drawings, journals, and fragments of a faith he was no longer allowed to speak of. One night his house servant, a woman named Ruth, followed him. She swore she heard chanting through the floorboards, and a low humming like bees trapped in a jar. When she peeked through the cracks, she saw a figure on his table. Too long, too still, and the Reverend's hands slick with blood and ink. He had written a word across the body's skin in Latin, gigante. The next morning, Ruth was gone. Her quarters were found empty, her bed still warm. The Reverend claimed she'd run away, but Elia began wearing a strip of cloth around her wrist, a pattern identical to Ruth's old apron. That Sunday, when the Reverend opened his Bible to preach, every page was blank, and for the first time in his life, he forgot the words to the Lord's Prayer. The church bells rang that Sunday, but no one came willingly. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of iron and rot from the fields. The Reverend stood at the pulpit, trembling, his face pale as bone. Behind him, the great wooden cross loomed, but something about it was wrong. It seemed darker, warped, as though the wood itself had begun to twist away from the light. He began his sermon in a cracked whisper. "Brothers and sisters, we are at war with what walks among us." But even as he spoke, the candles around him sputtered. The flame wouldn't hold. Then a deep hiss echoed through the chapel, like a great breath being drawn beneath the floorboards. From the back of the room, Elia appeared, barefoot, her dress still damp from the river. The congregation froze. No one dared breathe. Her shadow fell across the pews, long and heavy, like a blade cutting through the holy air. The Reverend's voice broke. He raised his hand to cast her out, but his Bible burst into flame before he could speak another word. The fire leapt from the pages to the pulpit, crawling up the walls, licking the faces of the saints painted in the stained glass. People screamed. They rushed for the doors, but Elia did not move. She stood in the center of the burning chapel, eyes fixed on the cross as it cracked and fell. When the smoke cleared, the church was ash. And in that ash, they found no bones, only footprints leading toward the river. When dawn came, the river was wrong. Its surface, once glassy and calm, now pulsed like something alive beneath the mist. The townsfolk gathered along the banks, clutching rosaries and trembling lanterns. Every few seconds the water shuddered, as if something vast were turning beneath it. Children claimed they saw faces in the current, eyes wide open, drifting just below the surface. The elders said the river was hungry again. That night the sheriff ordered torches lit and men sent downstream. Their dogs refused to go. The animals pulled against their leashes, whining, until one broke free and fled into the woods. Moments later, a sound split the silence. A wet crack followed by the echo of something heavy sinking. By morning, half the men were missing. The rest returned mute. They said nothing, only dropped their torches in the mud and walked home like ghosts. Later, a trapper found one of their boats half submerged near the bend. On the inside of its hull were prints, too large to be human, pressed deep into the wood as if shaped by stone hands. And on the riverbank, carved into a cypress tree, were words no one could explain. "The earth is her breath." When the preacher's son tried to scrape the letters away, the blade snapped clean in two. By nightfall, the river had gone still again, but the next morning the water had risen, just enough to cover the old graves at the edge of the field, and the soil began to move. It began with a sound, soft at first, like rain tapping on a coffin lid. The few who still lived on the Wren plantation said it came from the old burial field, the one fenced with bent iron and forgotten names. The soil there had swollen from the rain, but this was different. It was breathing. At midnight, a boy named Caleb, barely 13, swore he saw the ground pulse. He ran to fetch his mother, but by the time they returned, the air was vibrating, humming low like a great instrument tuning itself. Then the earth split. One by one, the graves began to open, not upward but inward, as though something below was pulling the bodies down. Wooden crosses snapped. The lantern light flickered. A smell rolled over the fields, sweet, metallic, and old. The boy screamed that he saw hands, too large, reaching from beneath the roots. By morning, the burial plot was gone. The land had swallowed it whole. Where the graves once lay, there was only a single depression in the earth, smooth as glass, reflecting the dawn like water. The townsfolk called it the Hollow, and no one went near it. But that night a sound rose from its center, a woman's voice humming low and deep, the rhythm older than scripture. The dogs barked until their throats gave out. When the sun rose, a figure stood at the edge of the hollow, taller than any man. Covered in mud and ash, Elia had returned. No one remembered walking to the hollow, yet by dusk nearly the whole town stood at its edge, as though something unseen had led them there. The air was heavy, too still, too quiet. Even the crickets refused to sing. In the center of the sunken earth, Elia stood motionless, her skin streaked with clay, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The preacher's son, barely able to breathe, swore that when she moved her lips, the ground trembled. Her voice wasn't human. It was a vibration that came from everywhere at once, through the soil, the trees, even the bones of the listeners. Some collapsed, clutching their ears. Others began whispering the sounds she made, as if repeating an old prayer they didn't understand. Witnesses claimed the dirt around her feet began to ripple. Something beneath the ground answered her. A pulse, slow and patient, felt like the earth itself had lungs. When the sheriff fired his pistol into the air, the bullet never came down. It vanished mid-flight. And when he turned to run, the ground split open beneath him. Only a few inches, just enough to take his footing. He fell hard, and when others tried to help, they couldn't find where he'd gone. The hole had already sealed. Elia lifted her head then. The sound stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It pressed against the chest as if the world itself had paused to listen. Then she spoke, just once in perfect English. "He is still in the soil." After that night, people began to vanish. Not in clusters, but one by one, like the town itself was being unstitched. The carpenter was the first, then a midwife, a stable boy, and finally the preacher's wife, who left behind only a single muddy footprint on her porch. Those who remained gathered in the ruins of the church, clutching candles, whispering prayers that no longer comforted. They said the hollow was spreading. The ground near it was cracking open in strange patterns, spirals, circles, veins. Some claimed to see roots moving underneath, growing upward instead of down. Searching, Sheriff Crane, desperate for order, led a few men to the abandoned Wren plantation house. Convinced Elia had taken shelter there. The house had been empty for years, its walls collapsing inward like ribs caving around a dead heart. Inside, the air was cold. Too cold. Every step echoed, and yet it felt as if the walls were listening. In the parlor they found vines, thick pale ones, creeping from beneath the floorboards. They weren't normal. They pulsed faintly, like veins. Crane lifted a board with his boot, revealing something beneath, a staircase made of root and bone, descending into the dark. He told the men to fetch oil lamps. None did. That night the plantation house burned to the ground. No one saw who lit the fire. But when the ashes cooled, the cellar door was still there, untouched, open, leading down, and from below came the sound of breathing. They say the human mind can convince itself of almost anything, until it meets the dark in its true form. 2 nights after the fire, 3 men went down into the cellar. Only one came back. His name was Amos Pike, a laborer with a scar across his jaw and eyes that, afterward, never closed all the way again. When the townsfolk found him wandering the road at dawn, his hands were shaking so violently he couldn't hold a cup. He told them what he'd seen beneath the house. The steps weren't built. They had grown. The roots were hard as bone, winding downward into a chamber that breathed. Every wall shimmered with a dampness that pulsed, as though alive. And at the center of that space, Amos said, there was a shape, too large to be human, yet unmistakably female, woven from the roots themselves. He saw faces tangled in the vines, their mouths open in silent screams. Some he recognized. One belonged to the sheriff, another to the midwife. When one of the men tried to cut a root to free them, the cellar began to hum, deep and low. The air grew hot and the walls tightened, like a lung inhaling. Then the lamp went out. Amos ran. When he reached the surface, the opening had sealed behind him, smooth as skin. He tried to show the others where it was, but the spot had disappeared. That night, the earth under the burned plantation cracked open again, just enough for a sound to rise through the dirt. A heartbeat, slow, heavy, endless. The heartbeat continued for 3 nights. It rolled beneath the town like distant thunder, shaking windows, loosening nails from their frames. Some said it came from the hollow. Others swore it came from beneath their own floors. No one slept. The cattle refused to graze. The children cried without knowing why. Every living thing felt the pulse, steady, deliberate, as if the ground itself were alive and remembering something it had long buried. On the fourth night, the preacher's son, Elias Fitch, took it upon himself to stop it. He believed the sound was the work of the devil, and that only consecrated ground could silence it. Carrying his father's Bible and a rusted lantern, he walked to the edge of the hollow. The heartbeat grew louder the closer he came, until it matched his own pulse perfectly. Elias fell to his knees and began to pray. But when he opened the Bible, the pages bled ink, thick black lines spilling across the words, forming shapes instead of sentences. The language he didn't know but somehow understood. He whispered the words aloud. The heartbeat stopped. For one breath, there was silence. Then the ground below him caved in. Witnesses said the earth opened like a mouth, swallowing him whole before sealing shut again. The lantern lay on the surface, still burning. When morning came, the entire field around the hollow was covered in handprints, hundreds of them, pressed deep into the soil, all reaching upward. And at the center stood Elijah, eyes closed, lips moving as if in prayer. By sunrise, word had spread. The soil was moving again. Entire patches of the cotton fields had withered overnight, their roots pushed up through the dirt like fingers. The few who dared approach said they could hear faint murmurs rising from beneath the ground. Thousands of whispers, layered and restless, like a congregation trapped beneath the earth. Those who listened too long said the voices began to shape their thoughts. They felt words forming in their own minds that were not their own. Words like remember, rise unfinished. The townsfolk begged Reverend Fitch to bless the land, but the old man could no longer speak. He sat in the back of the gutted church, eyes blank, clutching the charred remains of his Bible. When someone touched his shoulder, he shuddered and whispered, "It's not a curse. It's a return." That night, a storm rolled in from nowhere. Lightning forked across the fields, revealing figures standing in the rain, tall, unmoving, covered in mud. Dozens of them, their faces indistinct but their shape unmistakably human. When the lightning flashed again, they were gone. But the next morning, the footprints remained, huge, uneven, circling the field as though guarding something buried deep below. And right in the center of that pattern, where Elijah had last been seen, the ground was split open again, forming a perfect circle of dark, wet earth. At its edge lay a piece of wood scorched with words burned into it. "She is not dead. She is remembered." The town elders gathered what courage they had left and met inside the old courthouse, a building older than any of them, built with stone shipped from England long before the war. Its walls were cold, always damp, as if the place refused to forget. On that night the heartbeat had returned, so faint now that it could only be felt through the soles of their boots. But the walls themselves seemed to echo with it. Reverend Fitch's remaining journals were brought forth, the pages crumbling at the edges, ink eaten away by humidity and time. Yet some words still showed through. The earth remembers its design, the body its origin, the sin its architect. One man, Judge Harlan, recognized the phrase. It matched the inscription carved into a stone buried beneath the town square, an old marker no one had dared disturb. He ordered it dug up, hoping to find proof of some forgivable secret, a foundation, anything to explain what had begun. They worked through the night. Beneath the stone lay a vault, small, sealed with rusted chains. The judge himself broke them open. Inside was a figure, not of bone but of clay, tall, feminine, incomplete. Its eyes were missing, its mouth open as if waiting for air. Someone whispered that it looked like her. Then, before anyone could speak again, the clay began to crack. A sound filled the air, soft, brittle, unmistakable. The figure was breathing, and in that moment, every bell in town began to ring, though no one had touched them. At first, the sound of the bells was beautiful, high and distant, like the sky itself had opened. But then, as the tone deepened, something shifted. The air grew heavy, the ground vibrated, and the pitch sank into a low, mournful toll that felt less like metal and more like bone. No one could find their source. Every church bell in town was silent, still, untouched. Yet the sound went on, measured, deliberate, rhythmic. A call to remembrance. People began to see things when the bells rang. Shadows standing in the fields. A woman's outline etched against the horizon, towering and unbroken. Some said they saw faces in the window glass, faces that were not their own, staring back. When the sound finally stopped, the silence was unbearable. That same night, Judge Harlan disappeared. His wife said she found him in the square at dawn, kneeling before the cracked clay figure. His hands were raw, covered in dirt, as if he had been digging. In front of him was a pit, a fresh one, deep and perfectly round. From the edges of the hole, the same roots seen beneath the plantation had begun to sprout again. They shimmered faintly, pale as candlelight, twisting in patterns too deliberate to be natural. And inside the hole lay a single object. A skull, enormous, cracked clean through the crown. The judge's wife said he looked at her with empty eyes and whispered, "She was never buried." "We were." Then he smiled, a slow, awful smile, and stepped into the pit. By morning it had closed. By the time the sun rose over Lowndes County, the world above had begun to rot. Roads collapsed where none had cracked before. The courthouse leaned, its foundation hollow. People swore they could hear movement beneath their feet. Voices, footsteps, laughter that didn't belong to the living. An archivist named Margaret Coe was the first to notice the maps. She had been tasked with preserving the county records after the fires. What she found, hidden beneath the newer documents, chilled her. An older blueprint of the same town, drawn decades earlier, yet nearly identical. Every street, every building, except one difference. There was another town beneath it, buried rooms, tunnels, entire structures drawn directly under the living ones, as if Lowndes had been built twice, once in sunlight, once in shadow. And at the center of both maps, marked with the same symbol, a circle of roots. Margaret followed the old plans, tracing them to the outskirts of the fields where the hollow had first opened. She brought a lantern, a compass, and her courage. At the base of an old oak tree she found a door, half buried, made of iron, carved with spirals that seemed to move when the light touched them. She pried it open. Warm air rushed out, smelling faintly of earth and blood. Inside was a staircase leading down, lined with carvings of faces, hundreds of them, all looking upward. She descended. When her lantern flickered, she caught a glimpse of something vast at the tunnel's end. It was a town, silent, endless, built entirely of bone and root, and in its center stood a throne, empty, waiting. Margaret's breath came shallow as she stepped into the chamber. The air was damp, thick with the scent of clay and something ancient, older than rot, older than life itself. The lantern's flame trembled, barely holding its shape against the pulse that filled the space. The throne stood at the center of the underground city, carved from root and rib bone, polished to a gleam by unseen hands. Every surface was engraved with names, tens of thousands of them, looping endlessly in a script that seemed to shift when she looked too long. Margaret reached out. The instant her fingers brushed the armrest, the walls came alive. The carvings pulsed. The roots above began to move, twisting like veins beneath translucent skin. She felt something pass through her, a memory that wasn't hers. She saw fields burning, chains snapping. A woman, impossibly tall, lifting her hands to the sky as thunder split the horizon. The earth opened beneath her, swallowing her whole. Not to destroy her, but to preserve her. Elijah, The stories had gotten it wrong. She hadn't killed out of rage. She had risen to free the buried, to break the architecture of cruelty and replace it with remembrance. The earth had kept her secret, waiting for the moment to breathe again. As the vision faded, Margaret felt movement behind her. The clay figure, the one found beneath the courthouse, stood at the tunnel's mouth now. Its empty eyes were no longer empty. From somewhere deep within the chamber came a low voice, layered and immense, not heard but felt. "You built over my bones." The walls began to shake. The city was waking up. The shaking began deep and slow, like a creature stretching after centuries of sleep. Dust rained from the vaulted ceiling as the underground city stirred. Margaret staggered backward, shielding her face from the falling roots. Her lantern hit the floor, light spilling across carvings that now shifted in rhythm with the tremor. She realized the walls were breathing. Through the haze, she saw movement at the edges of the square, figures taking shape from the clay and root, peeling themselves from the earth like sculptures learning to walk. They were not alive, not dead, faces blank, skin veined with soil. Each one moved toward the throne, silent and obedient, as though drawn by memory itself. Above, in the real town, the ground began to crack. Foundations split. Streets sank. People fled into the fields as the soil rose and fell in waves. From the courthouse ruins to the charred plantation, the same sound returned, heartbeat upon heartbeat, echoing through the land like a buried choir. In the tunnels below, Margaret stood trembling before the throne as the clay figure reached her. It lifted a hand, massive, patient, and touched her forehead. Her mind filled with 1,000 voices at once. "We are not gone. We were made to remember." She saw every injustice, every life swallowed by the soil, every name erased by the living world above. And when she opened her eyes, she no longer stood alone. Rows of eyes stared back at her, awake, ancient, knowing. The city was rising. Above, the first building collapsed into the ground, quietly, as if swallowed by forgiveness. It began at dawn. A wind rose from the soil, warm and thick, carrying with it the scent of iron and wet roots. The air rippled like heat, though the morning was cold. Birds vanished from the sky. Dogs howled without cause. And then, beneath every foot in Lowndes County, the earth began to speak. It wasn't language at first, just vibration. But as it grew, words emerged, ancient and broken, overlapping like a chorus from deep underground. Every syllable seemed to know the listener by name. Every echo carried a memory not their own. The townsfolk fled into the open fields, covering their ears. But the sound came from within them now. Heartbeat matching heartbeat, soil matching breath, from the courthouse ruins. The ground split wide and roots burst upward like veins, wrapping around beams and stones. The clay figure rose with them, towering above the people, its hollow eyes glowing faintly with the light of molten earth. In the distance, Margaret emerged from the collapsing fields, her clothes soaked in mud. Her eyes, no longer her own, shone faintly gold. She walked calmly, unafraid, as though moving to meet something she had always known was waiting. The giant form, Elia reborn, shaped from the memories of those the world tried to erase, lowered her head. The sound quieted. For a single heartbeat, the land stood still. Then she spoke, her voice echoing through every body, every stone, every root. "You built your world upon our silence. Now the silence ends." The earth answered her with thunder, and the town began to sink. The sinking began without sound. One moment the town stood on its red soil. The next, it was descending, slow and inevitable, as though gravity itself had turned inward. Houses folded into themselves, church steeples bent like candle wax, the sky filled with dust that shimmered gold in the morning light, and through it, you could see the outline of something colossal rising from beneath, the forgotten city returning to claim its shadow. People ran toward the river, but the river no longer existed. It had turned to a mirror of black glass, perfectly still, reflecting not the sky above, but the tunnels below. In its reflection they saw 100 Elias, towering and silent, their faces solemn as monuments. Margaret stood at the center of the square, the ground opening around her in quiet spirals. The voices that once screamed were now calm, unified, an ancient hum that felt like mourning and forgiveness at once. She understood now, this was not vengeance. It was remembrance made flesh. The courthouse collapsed into the earth, its clock tower sinking last, the hands frozen at the hour the first sermon had burned. The plantation fields followed, cotton roots snapping like brittle cords as the soil devoured their rows. And when the last building vanished, the earth closed again, smooth, unbroken, as if nothing had ever been there. All that remained was an endless plain of red clay. The wind returned, carrying a faint hum, a heartbeat fading into the horizon, and somewhere deep below, the city breathed. Months passed, though time felt uncertain on the land where Lowndes County had once stood. Travelers spoke of the strange plain that now stretched for miles, flat as glass, without a single ruin, tree, or stone. When the wind blew, the ground shimmered like water, and some swore they could hear faint voices beneath their boots whispering in unison. "We are still here." Surveyors sent by the state found their compasses spinning without direction. Machinery broke without cause. At night, lights were seen flickering in the distance, columns of soft gold that pulsed like veins. They called it the Plains of Memory, though locals refused to go near it. One man who did, an old photographer named James Hollis, set up his camera at the edge of the red earth. He took a single photograph before fleeing. The image, when developed, showed more than he had seen. Outlines of structures beneath the surface, rows of faces looking upward, eyes open. Weeks later, his house burned down. The photograph was never found. Margaret Coe was never seen again. But a letter surfaced months later, addressed to no one, written in an unsteady hand. "The ground beneath us is not dead. It remembers every step, every wound, every name buried without prayer. She sleeps below, not in anger, but in memory." The silence was never meant to last. By the next spring, wildflowers grew across the plain, white blossoms shaped like open hands, and when the wind passed through them, the earth seemed to hum softly, almost peacefully, as though it were singing to itself. The last record of Lowndes County came from a preacher named Isaiah Bell, whose church once stood at the edge of the vanished town. In 1903, he was found wandering along the Alabama highway, barefoot and delirious, clutching a rusted pocket watch that no longer ticked. He spoke little, except when fever dreams overtook him. Then his voice dropped low, heavy, as if echoing through another body. She wasn't human, not like us. She remembered before remembering was born. According to his testimony, written by the physician who tended to him, Isaiah claimed he had seen the earth open a second time. From the red clay, he said, rose a woman taller than any tree, her hair woven with roots, her eyes full of light. She didn't speak, but when she looked at him, he felt his memories unspool. His ancestors, his sins, his silence, all laid bare before her. He fell to his knees. She placed her massive hand on the ground beside him and whispered a single word he could never recall. When he awoke, the plain was empty again. Isaiah died days later. The doctor's final note reads, "His pupils were gold. The site of Lowndes County remains unmarked. But sometimes when storms roll across Alabama, the lightning strikes in a perfect circle where the town once was. And in the flash, travelers swear they see a colossal shadow, kneeling, head bowed, listening. Perhaps she's not waiting for vengeance anymore. Perhaps she's waiting for us to remember."